Some dogs bark at strangers, others bark at thunder. But this one, he barked at the floorboards and refused to stop. That's how it all began. Storm froze. The room was empty. Dusty desks, peeling alphabet posters, a chalkboard with the words "Be kind to others" fading under age and neglect. But none of that mattered to Storm, the German Shepherd K-9 officer standing stiff as a statue in the far corner of the unused third-grade classroom. His handler, Officer Rachel Barnes, watched him closely. He wasn't barking, not yet, but something had changed. The slight tilt of his ears, the low, rumbling growl starting deep in his chest. His eyes were locked on a specific point in the floor, like he could see something buried beneath the layers of dust and wood. "Storm," Rachel said softly. She crouched beside him. He didn't look at her. Instead, he nudged forward, nose pressed tight to a cracked floorboard near the wall, sniffing hard. His body vibrated with tension. They were only supposed to be here for a quick community outreach visit. Officer meets kids, K-9 wins hearts, a feel-good PR moment for the department. The school had even printed little badges with honorary deputy in Comic Sans for the first graders. But this room, room 204, wasn't on the tour. It wasn't even in use. "Custodians say it's been shut for months," the principal had told her. "Old floorboards, leaky ceiling. We keep it locked." But the door had been ajar when Rachel walked past. Storm had pulled her toward it, insistent, and now he wouldn't move. "Is there a gas leak under here?" she whispered. She reached down to touch the floor, then paused. Storm's nose was pressed flat to the seam between boards. He started pawing at it. Okay, easy, buddy." She glanced around. "What are you trying to tell me?" He growled, louder now. A low, muffled thump echoed beneath the floor. Rachel jerked back. She looked down at the planks. Another sound, softer, scratching, like nails on wood. It could have been a raccoon, a rat, old pipes shifting. But Rachel knew that sound. She'd heard it before, 3 years ago, when Storm had helped rescue a teenage boy locked inside an abandoned freight container in the woods. That same eerie tapping, a faint, desperate rhythm, like someone trying to say "I'm here" without making noise. She stood up fast and stepped back from the corner. Storm sat unmoving, eyes locked on the spot. Rachel radioed in. "This is Officer Barnes at Creek View Elementary. I need building blueprints for the South Wing, room 204. "Why?" came the reply. "Something's not right." That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She sat on her front porch in the dark, Storm resting at her feet. Every once in a while, he lifted his head and stared at her, tail thumping once, like asking, "Are we going back?" She opened her laptop. Creekview Elementary had been renovated 3 times since 1974. The original structure was built in the 50s, brick and wood. No official records showed any basement or crawl space under the South Wing. But the old blueprints? They were harder to find. At 1:47 a.m., she came across a grainy black and white floor plan archived in a forgotten City Hall database. Bingo! A note scrawled on the bottom corner. "Original basement access sealed, 1989. By the next morning, Rachel had the keys. She didn't wait for backup. Not yet. Storm practically dragged her back to room 204. This time, she came prepared, with gloves, a crowbar, and a quiet sense of dread. The floorboards resisted at first. They'd been nailed down decades ago, but one by one, she pried them up until the air changed. Cold, metallic, like opening an old freezer. Beneath the boards, dirt, and in the middle, a square wooden hatch. Its iron hinges rusted, sealed with an old chain looped through 2 eyelets. Storm whined, low and urgent. Rachel knelt down and touched the hatch. A chill shot through her hand. This wasn't a storage room. This wasn't an old janitor's access. She could feel it in her gut. Something was buried here. Something alive. She lowered a small flashlight into the gap between the boards and the hatch, trying to get a better look. Dust, cobwebs, scraps of paper, something that looked like a torn notebook page. She tilted the light. A glint of plastic caught her eye. A child's toy. A yellow spinning top, cracked on one side. Rachel exhaled slowly. No way. Storm barked once, short, sharp. She recoiled. The sound came again, from beneath the hatch. 3 knocks, then silence. Rachel backed away, breathing hard. She grabbed her radio. "Dispatch, I need immediate support at Creekview Elementary, room 204. Possible access to an unregistered underground chamber. Repeat, possible live situation." Storm growled, now facing the door. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone was coming. But she hadn't told anyone she was here. Rachel Barnes wasn't the kind of cop who spooked easily. She'd handled standoffs, drug busts, even a near-fatal domestic call in 19 that left a scar just below her ribcage. But as she crouched there in room 204, one hand resting on her canine's thick neck, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Raw, unshakable dread. The wooden hatch beneath the floor had gone silent again. No more tapping, no more whispers, just stillness. And then the doorknob rattled. Storm sprang to his feet, low growl rumbling in his chest. Rachel stood quickly, unclipping the safety strap on her holster. The hallway outside should have been empty. No classes in session, no janitors scheduled. She hadn't told anyone she was here, not even her lieutenant. "Who's there?" she called out. Silence. She crept toward the classroom door, Storm at her side. She twisted the knob and flung it open. Nothing. Just the echo of her own breath in the still hallway. Storm sniffed the air, alert but not alarmed. Whoever it was had either changed their mind or vanished. Rachel eased the door shut and locked it from the inside. Then she turned back to the hatch. This time she didn't hesitate. She took out her multi-tool, wedged the blade into the rusty chain, and began to saw. Bit by bit, the metal gave way. The link squealed and groaned under pressure. When the final link snapped, it echoed through the empty room like a gunshot. Storm sat beside her, tense but still. Rachel took a breath and gripped the old iron handle. It was colder than she expected. She pulled. The hatch creaked open a few inches, then stuck. She yanked harder. Dust exploded into the air, and the smell that followed was a mix of mildew, rust, and something else. Something old, something wrong. She pointed her flashlight into the hole. Dirt steps, wooden walls, a tunnel. No, a staircase leading down into darkness. Storm growled again, deep and primal. Rachel clicked on her body cam. Creekview Elementary, room 204, unregistered substructure confirmed. Descending for initial recon, K-9 officer Storm accompanying. She waited for dispatch to respond. Nothing. The radio buzzed static. She tapped it, still nothing. "Let's go," she whispered, more to herself than to Storm. He took the lead, stepping onto the creaky stairs like he'd done it 100 times. Rachel followed, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. Dust danced in the beam like snowflakes in slow motion. The air was damp and still. Each step groaned under her weight. Halfway down, her boot slipped on loose dirt. She caught herself on the wall. Something flaked off. Peeling wallpaper. Yellowed and old-fashioned with faded sailboats. Children's wallpaper. She frowned. This wasn't a storage room. It had been decorated. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a narrow hallway. Low ceiling, cracked walls. A bare light bulb hung from a wire above, but it was dead. Rachel swept the flashlight slowly side to side. On the left wall, scribbles, stick figures, a sun, a crude drawing of a dog, crayons maybe. On the right wall, tally marks, hundreds of them. Storm sniffed along the ground, then suddenly sat, right in front of a door with no handle. Rachel stepped closer. Something scratched into the wood caught her eye. No bad dreams here. She swallowed hard. A metal latch held the door shut from the outside. "Storm," she said quietly, her voice catching. The German Shepherd stood ready, eyes locked on the door. Rachel flipped the latch. She pushed the door open slowly. The beam of her flashlight fell on a small room, bare concrete floor, a few tattered blankets, and something in the far corner. A shape, hunched, breathing. "Hey," Rachel said gently, raising one hand. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Officer Barnes. This is Storm. We're here to help." The figure didn't move at first, then it flinched, just slightly. A girl, thin, pale, maybe 8 or 9, wearing an oversized hoodie stained with dirt. Her blonde hair was matted and her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked like she hadn't seen daylight in weeks. Storm didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply sat down, his tail still, ears forward. "Sweetheart, you're okay now," Rachel said, crouching low. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl opened her mouth and let out a whisper so quiet Rachel had to lean in. "Don't wake him." Rachel's heart skipped. "Him? Who's him?" The girl shook her head violently. "He gets mad when I talk." Rachel scanned the room again. No one else. No shadows. No doors. Just this single awful room. "Where is he now?" Rachel asked. The girl pointed at the ceiling. Rachel looked up. No vents. No crawl space. Just moldy wooden planks. She turned back. "Are you alone down here?" The girl didn't answer. Rachel reached for her radio again. Still dead. She looked at Storm. He stared toward the hallway. His ears twitched. Then she heard it too. A footstep, upstairs. Then another, heavy, slow. Rachel's blood went cold. Whoever had rattled that doorknob earlier hadn't left. And they weren't in a hurry. They were still inside the building. Okay, Rachel whispered. New plan. She turned to the girl. We're going to get out of here. I promise. But we have to be quiet. Do you understand? The girl nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Rachel took off her jacket and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. Then she picked her up. The child was frighteningly light. Storm led the way back to the stairwell, his body coiled and ready. Every few steps he paused, listening. Rachel gripped her flashlight like a weapon. She was running through worst-case scenarios in her head. Ambush at the hatch, blocked door, what if the phone dies, what if it's someone armed? They reached the base of the stairs. The hatch above them was still open, but the light in room 204 was off. She hadn't turned it off. Storm growled, a low, chilling sound that filled the basement with tension. Rachel climbed the steps with the girl in her arms, every creak of the wood echoing like a shout. She reached the top and peeked out into the room. Empty, silent, but something had changed. Her bag, which she'd left near the teacher's desk, was gone. So was the crowbar. Storm circled the room once, sniffing, then walked slowly to the chalkboard and sat. He let out a single bark. Rachel turned the flashlight on the board. A new message had been written. In thick, white chalk, in someone else's hand. She wasn't the only one. The message on the chalkboard sent a chill crawling down Rachel Barnes's spine. She wasn't the only one. She stared at the chalk, still fresh. The edges of each letter were just slightly smudged, like someone had written it quickly, nervously. Rachel's grip on her flashlight tightened. Her eyes swept the room. No one, nothing. Just the whisper of silence, broken only by Storm's steady breathing. The little girl clung to her shoulder, her fingers gripping the collar of Rachel's uniform with quiet desperation. She hadn't said another word since whispering, "Don't wake him." Rachel exhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to calm. She needed to think clearly, strategically. Whoever wrote that message had been inside the room with them, and somehow they'd vanished. She backed out of room 204 and into the hallway, Storm at her heel. The building was still locked down, every classroom dark, hallways echoing with their own emptiness. It felt like a forgotten world, a school frozen in time. Rachel tried her radio again, still dead. No signal, no backup, no time to waste. She looked down at the girl. "I'm taking you somewhere safe, all right?" The girl didn't respond, just pressed her cheek tighter against Rachel's shoulder. Storm led the way, nose low, ears twitching. Rachel moved quickly but quietly through the halls, passing faded student artwork, trophy cases gathering dust, and motivational signs that now felt hollow in the darkness. Be brave. You are not alone. If only they knew. The nurse's office on the first floor had a working landline. Rachel had used it once before during a lockdown drill. She moved fast, entered the room, and locked the door behind her. The girl sat quietly on the cot in the corner, knees drawn up again. Rachel dialed dispatch. It rang. Twice, then clicked. "County Sheriff's Office, It's Barnes, Officer Rachel Barnes. I need immediate response to Creekview Elementary. I've recovered a missing child from a sealed basement beneath room 204. There's more, possibly more victims still down there. Someone else is in the building." "Wait, hold on. Slow down." "I can't. Just send backup, EMTs too, and notify the parents of Abigail Moore." A beat of silence. "Did you say Abigail Moore, as in the Moore girl who vanished last fall?" Rachel looked over at the girl. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "That's her." Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Rachel stayed near the front entrance, one hand on her weapon, the other gripping her flashlight like a lifeline. Storm sat beside her, his eyes scanning the shadows. The little girl, now confirmed to be Abigail Moore, refused to let go of Storm. She had curled against his side like he was a living wall against the dark. When the cruisers pulled up, Rachel stepped out, met her lieutenant halfway. "What the hell happened in there?" he demanded. Rachel didn't waste time explaining. "There's a basement under room 204 that doesn't exist on any current blueprints. At least 4 rooms, one locked. I only got into one. Abigail was inside." The lieutenant paled. "We've had her picture on the wall for 7 months. Storm found her." "And the chalkboard?" Rachel nodded. "Someone else was in the building. He knew we were there." "Who?" "I don't know. But they were watching." By sunrise, the building was crawling with uniforms. Crime scene tape wrapped around the school like a warning. Forensics arrived with dogs of their own. K9 Storm stayed close, tail stiff, eyes never stopping. Rachel gave her full report, step by step, every detail. The hatch, the staircase, the girl, the voice, the message. But there were no fingerprints, no signs of recent forced entry. The crowbar and her backpack were found later, outside near the school's loading dock, as if someone had taken them and then left them in plain sight. Rachel watched from her cruiser as Abigail was reunited with her parents. The mother dropped to her knees, sobbing. The father clutched his daughter like he'd never let go. The girl barely spoke, just kept one hand clutched in Storm's thick fur. When EMTs tried to examine her, she whispered one word, basement. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat with a city archivist at the county records office, surrounded by dust-covered ledgers and faded microfiche scans. Creekview was originally a one-room schoolhouse, the archivist said, back in the 50s, before it was expanded, before the annex was built. Did it have a basement? Some schools built fallout shelters back then. Cold War paranoia. But that would be registered. The archivist paused. Not always. Some were kept off the books, emergency shelters, sometimes used for disciplinary purposes before regulations changed. Rachel looked up. Are you saying they used to lock children in basements as punishment? I'm saying you'd be surprised what small-town schools tried to hide back then. Back at the station, Rachel sat at her desk, staring at a grainy photo of the original Creekview staff, circa 1958. 12 people, all unsmiling. She recognized one name on the caption. William Grady, janitor. Same last name as the old groundskeeper who retired a few years ago. She pulled up personnel files. Grady, Harold Grady, son of William. He worked there for 42 years. No criminal record, no complaints, never married. Lived in a trailer just outside town. Rachel closed the file. Storm lifted his head and growled, low, deep. Rachel turned. Her window, which had been closed, now sat open an inch. On the sill, a single yellow crayon. She moved fast. Storm was at her side before she even reached the hallway. Grady, she muttered under her breath. You've got to be kidding me. She radioed dispatch. Need unit support. Possible suspect tied to Creekview abductions. Last known address, trailer park off County Route 14. Name's Harold Grady. By the time they arrived at the trailer, it was empty. No signs of forced entry. No Grady. But the walls were covered in childlike drawings. Hundreds of them. Stick figures, cages, staircases, dogs, and one drawing in particular, a stick figure with X's for eyes. Standing beside a square, labeled, "The door that stays shut." Rachel stepped outside, nausea twisting in her gut. This wasn't over. Abigail had survived, but the drawing on the wall confirmed what Rachel already feared. There were more kids still down there, and whoever had built that place, they knew how to vanish. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a cold mug of black coffee, staring at the yellow crayon she'd bagged into evidence, the same kind that had been used on the basement wall beneath room 204. She must have replayed the past 24 hours in her head 100 times. The tapping under the floor, the whisper in the dark, the message on the chalkboard. Storm lay at her feet, not asleep either. His ears twitched every few seconds like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. They were both waiting for something. Maybe it was a knock. Maybe it was another missing piece of the puzzle. Maybe it was someone who didn't want the puzzle solved. By mid-morning, the school had been cordoned off with crime scene tape. No students, no staff, just investigators, technicians, and a rising tension that no one could quite name out loud. Rachel was back at room 204, standing just outside the doorway. I don't want you going down there alone again, her lieutenant said, arms crossed. I won't be where. Rachel replied, I'll have Storm. The lieutenant exhaled, rubbing his face. You sure this is a good idea? No, but I'm sure it's the only one we've got. He didn't stop her. The hatch creaked open with the same hollow groan, the rusted hinges resisting as Rachel pulled it wide. A floodlight had been lowered in earlier by forensics, but it barely lit the stairs, like the shadows themselves refused to move. She clipped her body cam on again, adjusted her belt, and looked at Storm. Let's finish what we started. They descended slowly. The basement air hit her like a memory, wet, metallic, heavy with mold and time. The crayon drawings were still there. So were the tally marks. Rachel had brought backup this time, but they waited above. This was her lead, and she wanted a clear look. No noise, no distractions. Storm walked carefully, his movements silent and calculated. They reached the first chamber, the one where Abigail had been found. Empty now, just a blanket and the faint impression of her small body still visible in the dust. Rachel moved deeper. The hallway was longer than she remembered. Or maybe fear distorted distance. She counted 3 closed doors on her left. Each one had a latch on the outside. Prison cells. The first one opened easily. Empty. Just 4 walls, a plastic spoon, and a child's sock. The second was harder to open. The shoulder of our arm. The wood had swollen with moisture. Inside, a rusted bucket, a torn-up composition notebook, and something scribbled on the far wall. Rachel stepped closer and read the words aloud. He said we were ghosts. That's why no one was looking. She swallowed hard. Storm sniffed along the baseboards, then suddenly stopped. He let out a low bark and scratched at the corner. Rachel knelt beside him. There, barely visible, was a tiny vent, just a few inches wide. Inside, stuffed deep into the metal tubing, was something red. She reached in and pulled it free. A child's mitten. Red, wool, stained. The initials AB were stitched on the inside tag. Abigail Moore. Rachel stood slowly, heart heavy. She turned to the last door. The latch was sealed tight, this time with a bolt lock. This door was newer, stronger. She reached for her keys, trying combinations one by one. None worked. Storm growled again. He was pacing now. Rachel stepped back and radioed up to her team. I need bolt cutters down here. Door 3, heavy resistance. The reply came, on their way. Rachel waited in the dim hallway, flashlight pointed at the door. Then quietly she heard it. A thud, then another, then a voice. Soft. Help! She stepped closer, pressing her ear to the wood. Another voice joined it. Quieter, younger. She said you'd come. Rachel's throat tightened. She glanced at Storm. He was seated now, completely still, staring at the door with a focus that almost looked human. The bolt cutters arrived. She took them without a word. With a single loud snap, the lock fell to the floor. Rachel paused, hand on the doorknob. Then she opened it. Inside, 3 children sat on the concrete floor. 2 boys and 1 girl, ages 6 to maybe 10. They looked up, dazed by the light, squinting, shielding their eyes. The girl flinched when Rachel stepped in. It's okay, Rachel said softly. I'm Officer Barnes. This is Storm. You're safe now. The older boy spoke first. Are you real? I am. Are you going to take us home? Absolutely. They stood slowly, weak but walking. The youngest boy clung to Storm instantly, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. Rachel didn't rush them. She didn't ask questions, not yet. She called for medical, backup poured in, blankets, water, soft voices. The children were guided out one by one, but the girl, she hesitated. She looked back at the far wall. There's another room, she said. Rachel turned. What room? Behind that one. She pointed to a corner where 2 walls met at a strange angle. Storm was already moving. He walked to the seam and sniffed along the edge. Rachel followed him, running her hand along the wall until she found it. A hairline crack, a false wall. Get me thermal imaging, she called out. It arrived minutes later. The readout showed a hidden space just 5 feet wide, but something inside was giving off a heat signature. Rachel stood still. Another child? Or someone else? She ordered her team to clear the hallway. Only Storm stayed. She wedged her crowbar into the crack and pushed. The false wall shifted. Dust flew. And then, darkness. Rachel stepped inside, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. It wasn't a room. It was a tunnel, roughly cut, with wooden beams every 10 feet and a dirt floor. She followed it 20 yards until she found the end. A trap door. She knelt down and touched it. Still warm. Recently used. She looked back at Storm. He was here, she whispered. He's still using this. Outside, the sun had started to set. But Rachel knew this was far from over. 3 more kids found. 1 already rescued. But that made 4. And she remembered the girl's drawing in part 2. 5 stick figures. 1 was still missing. And Rachel was starting to realize this wasn't just one man's secret. This was a system. A buried history no one had dared to dig up. Until now, the tunnel was narrow and damp, carved through the dirt like a forgotten artery beneath the school. Rachel had crawled through tighter spaces before, under trailers, through crawl spaces during raids. But this was different. This was built with intention. It wasn't just a hole, it was an escape route, and someone had used it. Recently, she could feel it in the warmth of the ground, the subtle freshness of a footprint, the musky scent of stale sweat still clinging to the earth. Storm stayed just behind her, low to the ground, moving silently. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. But Rachel could tell he was locked in, like he knew they were getting close. The trapdoor at the end of the tunnel opened into a utility access crawl space beneath the old gymnasium. Sealed off during renovations years ago. No wonder no one had noticed it. Rachel pushed up the loose grate and climbed into the storage room. It smelled like mildew and old rubber, forgotten equipment, and rotting wood. Storm followed, ears twitching, nose working in overtime. Rachel moved slowly, flashlight off now, only using the pale light coming through a dust-streaked high window. Then she heard it. Footsteps above her, slow, deliberate. Someone walking the old bleachers. Rachel moved like a ghost, hugging the wall, every instinct screaming to stay quiet. Storm's breathing was silent, his body perfectly in sync with hers. She stepped up toward the side door that led into the gym. The footsteps stopped. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Then creak. A soft, metal groan, like a hinge turning. Rachel unholstered her weapon, pressed her back to the frame, counted to 3, and pushed through. The gym was empty. Bleachers stacked up. Basketball hoops pulled high. A single folding chair sat in the middle of the court like someone had left in a hurry. Rachel stepped forward, checking her corners. Nothing but dust and silence. Storm sniffed the air, then froze. He turned sharply toward a corner of the bleachers and growled. Rachel raised her gun and aimed. Step out, hands visible. Nothing. She took 2 steps forward, heart pounding. Storm barked, loud and sharp. A figure emerged. An old man, gray hair, ball cap, tan jacket smeared with dirt. He held his hands up slowly, eyes wide. Easy now, he said. No trouble here. Rachel narrowed her gaze. Name. Grady, Harold Grady. Of course it was. Rachel stepped closer, weapon still raised. You built the basement, didn't you? Grady blinked. I don't know what you mean. The tunnel, the sealed rooms, you've been using them. I've maintained this building for 42 years, he said calmly. That basement's been there longer than I've been alive. You were seen, you left a message on the chalkboard. No, ma'am, he said. I don't even know what room you're talking about. Rachel motioned Storm forward. The dog advanced, standing protectively in front of her, eyes locked on Grady. You took those children. Grady's expression changed, just slightly. A twitch of the cheek, a flicker of something in his eyes. I saved them, he said softly. Rachel stiffened. What? You think they were the first ones to be forgotten? He muttered. You think this town cares what happens to the ones who fall through the cracks? I care, Rachel snapped. No, you don't, he said. Not until one of them shows up at your station. Not until a dog scratches at a floor. Storm growled again. Rachel's hands were steady, but her voice cracked with fury. Where's the 5th child? Grady smiled and said nothing. They arrested him on the spot. No resisting, no fighting, just quiet compliance. At the station, he refused to speak to anyone but Rachel. In the interrogation room, she sat across from him, the air thick with silence. I'm not here to play games, she said. There's a 5th child, one still missing. Grady leaned forward. You found 4. Rachel didn't move. I was one of those kids, you know, he said after a while. Back when it was still just one room and a coal stove, they kept us down there when we acted out, called it time to think. She swallowed, refusing to show emotion. You learn a lot in a hole, Grady continued. You learn to hear things the others miss, like who gets picked up and who gets forgotten. Who did this with you? No one, he said. I just kept the tradition alive. Rachel slammed her fist on the table. Where is the last one, Grady? He looked up, eyes twinkling. She's the quiet one, always has been, likes to draw. Rachel stormed out, shaking. She found Storm waiting by the cruiser, pacing. We're missing something, she muttered. She pulled out the old drawing Abigail had made, the one with 5 stick figures. One of them had a ponytail and a purple scribble above her head. Rachel had thought it was just a child's messy artwork, but now she looked closer. It wasn't a scribble. It was a shape, like an arrow. Pointing up, she drove back to the school. Storm bolted out of the cruiser and made a beeline, not for the classroom, not for the gym, but the attic. The entrance was above the main office, a trap door with a steel ladder. Rachel pulled it down and climbed quickly. Dust, heat, darkness, and something else. A faint humming. Storm was already inside, nose to the floor. Rachel swept the flashlight slowly across the insulation. Then she saw it. A small box fan plugged into an old outlet. Beside it, a blanket, a water bottle, a child's sketchbook, and curled up in the far corner, a little girl. She looked up, eyes wide and unblinking. Rachel didn't move. It's okay, she said softly. You're safe now. Storm sat beside the girl. She reached out and touched his head, fingers trembling. Rachel didn't need to ask her name. She already knew. The 5th child was real. She had never left the building. That night, as the last child was carried into an ambulance, Rachel sat on the school steps, completely still. Storm rested beside her, eyes half closed. The town would talk for weeks. News vans would swarm. Reporters would dig. But Rachel? She'd remember the drawings, the tally marks, the way a dog growled at a piece of wood and changed everything. And the question that still hadn't been answered, how many other rooms were still sealed? 2 days had passed since the fifth child was found. 2 days since Storm sniffed out a little girl hiding in the attic, malnourished, silent, and wrapped in a blanket that smelled like insulation and fear. Rachel Barnes had barely slept since, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still missing. The town was in chaos. Media trucks lined the streets outside Creekview Elementary. Parents demanded answers. Teachers gave tearful interviews. And the school district issued a carefully worded press release that felt like a blanket tossed over a wildfire. But Rachel wasn't interested in spin. She was interested in the truth. And she didn't believe for a second that Harold Grady had done this alone. He was still in custody, refused a lawyer, refused food, refused to speak, just sat there staring at the wall, humming old hymns under his breath. Rachel had watched him through the glass. There was something too calm about him, like he had already made peace with something the rest of them hadn't caught up to yet. "Did he ever talk about anyone else?" Rachel asked Detective Shaw. "Not a word. Keeps saying it was all his idea, that he did it to protect the forgotten, whatever the hell that means." Rachel shook her head. "No, he's protecting someone." She returned to the school again, alone this time. Storm followed without hesitation, paws tapping gently against the tile floor as they walked through the now abandoned hallways. Crime scene tape still fluttered across room 204, but Rachel didn't stop there. She went to the records office, the one no one had bothered to search yet. The walls were lined with filing cabinets so old they might as well have been part of the original foundation. Most of the files were dusty, faded ink, but still readable. Rachel sat down and started digging. She worked backwards, starting from the year Grady was hired, 1981. Dozens of employee files. Teachers, janitors, substitute staff, bus drivers. One name caught her eye. Nancy Calhoun, hired 1982, assistant janitor, no termination date. But no retirement papers either. She opened the folder. There were 3 documents. One was her application. One was a W-2 form from 1990. And the third, a handwritten note on school letterhead. Reassigned, keep off public records. Rachel stared at it. No signature, no explanation. Just 3 words. Storm let out a low chuff, drawing her attention. He was sniffing the bottom drawer of another cabinet, pawing gently. Rachel opened it. Inside was a rolled-up blueprint. She unfurled it across the floor. It was the original layout of the Creekview schoolhouse. She traced her finger across the familiar classrooms, the gym, the main office. But then she saw something new, something that didn't exist in the current building. C Hall, sub-basement 2. She snapped a photo with her phone and drove straight to the county assessor's office. An older man named Carl, who had worked there for 30 years, looked over her findings. "You say this was under the school?" She nodded. "It's not on any current plans." He scratched his head. Back in the 60s and 70s, they didn't report every add-on. If it wasn't load-bearing or tied to plumbing, they just built it. "Can someone build a sub-basement without a permit?" He gave her a tired smile. "Lady, this is a small town. We used to build sheds and call them classrooms. Half the codes didn't even exist until '88. Rachel leaned in. "Do you recognize the name Nancy Calhoun?" He paused, then nodded. "Used to work with her son, quiet kid, always had paint on his hands. She died in, what was it, 95? Accident? Fire. Her trailer burned down out on Ash Creek Road." Rachel froze. She knew that area. It was just a mile behind the school. That night, she returned with a flashlight and Storm. Ash Creek Road was overgrown now, long forgotten. But the charred remains of the trailer were still there. Twisted metal and blackened wood buried beneath layers of weeds and time. Storm moved ahead, sniffing around the rubble. Rachel scanned the area, eyes catching on something half buried under an old toolbox. She knelt and pulled it free. It was a rusted lunchbox. Inside, a collection of crayon drawings. The same style, the same stick figures. Each drawing showed a child in a box, or underground, or screaming behind a door. And in every single one, there was a figure standing nearby. A woman, gray hair, big glasses, holding a ring of keys. Nancy Calhoun. Rachel returned to the precinct that night with the lunchbox in hand. She placed it in front of Grady. He didn't flinch. "Did she help you?" Rachel asked softly. He said nothing. "She started it, didn't she?" Still nothing. Rachel opened the lid and placed one of the drawings on the table. Grady's eyes flicked down for just a moment. Then he whispered, "She kept the quiet ones." Rachel leaned in. "How many?" Grady looked at her, And for the first time in days, he smiled. Not all ghosts live in the dark. That night, Rachel couldn't sit still. Storm paced the porch, growling at shadows. The name Nancy Calhoun echoed in her ears. She made a decision. The blueprints hadn't lied before. She was going back down. To sub-basement 2. The next morning, with full support from her team, Rachel led a tactical crew beneath the school. Storm walked beside her, tail high, body alert. They followed the map from the original blueprint, past room 204, beyond the first basement, down a hallway sealed behind an old supply closet. The door had been painted over dozens of times, but it opened with the master key, inside a narrow stairwell, concrete, dusty, cold. They descended, 15 steps, then 20, then 40, until they reached the bottom. A metal door with a circular handle stood in front of them. Rachel pulled. It opened. The air was colder here, thicker, and it smelled like old clothes and forgotten time. Storm growled once and moved ahead. Rachel followed. The room was lined with lockers and desks and shelves filled with old toys. Not new ones. Vintage, 1950s, 1960s. Tin soldiers, ragged teddy bears, board games that hadn't been sold in decades. And on the far wall, a list written in chalk. Names, first names only. Some with tally marks next to them, some with X's. And at the very bottom, 2 names freshly added, Abigail, Emma, the 2 girls Rachel had helped rescue. Storm sat beside the list and whined. Rachel's heart pounded. There were more names on that list than anyone had reported missing. And she had a horrible feeling. Some of them had never been reported at all. The list on the wall haunted her. It wasn't just the names, though there were dozens of them. It was the way some were crossed out. Others had tally marks. A few had dates scribbled beside them, years old, but most had nothing, no last names, no context, no birth dates. Just first names, Timmy, Ava, Joseph, Danielle, Ray, and near the bottom, Abigail, Emma, fresh chalk. The girls Rachel had helped pull from the darkness just days ago. Storm sat beneath the list, ears drooping, his usually sharp eyes filled with something Rachel couldn't name, something between exhaustion and grief, as if even he understood the weight of what they'd found. Rachel scanned the rest of the room. Dust, old furniture, boxes of school supplies that hadn't been used since the Cold War, shelves of forgotten books. The air was thick and stale, like it had never been meant to breathe. But that list meant someone kept track, and that meant someone had never stopped watching. The investigation that followed was swift, but not clean. Grady remained uncooperative. Beyond his cryptic mutterings and the occasional offhand remark about the quiet ones or the undesirables, he offered no hard details. He never confirmed who else helped him. He never denied it either. It took Rachel and her team a week to verify even half the names on that chalkboard. Some were real. Some were never reported missing. Kids from broken homes, foster kids who ran away, children from out-of-town shelters whose paperwork had vanished over the decades, kids whose parents were too high, too scared, or too absent to file a report. It was like peeling back the wallpaper of the town and finding rot underneath. The local government tried to control the narrative. Tragic case of a lone predator. Rogue janitor operating in secret. Rachel wanted to scream. This wasn't just a lone predator. This was systemic neglect. People had looked away for years, maybe decades. That basement didn't build itself. The tunnels didn't dig themselves. The sealed rooms didn't appear overnight. And that list, it had evolved over time. Multiple handwriting styles. Some chalked in small, neat cursive. Others sloppy, childlike, rushed. Rachel began to suspect that even some of the children themselves had been forced to write it. A week after the final room was uncovered, Rachel sat with Abigail in a quiet room at the Children's Advocacy Center. The little girl was drawing again. She no longer shook when people touched her. She laughed sometimes, especially when Storm was in the room. But she still didn't like doors being closed. Rachel sat beside her as Abigail finished her latest picture. It showed 5 stick figures, like before. Only this time, each figure was smiling. Rachel noticed something new. A 6th figure, drawn smaller, faded at the edge of the page. "Who's that?" she asked gently. Abigail shrugged. "Do you know their name?" The girl hesitated. Then she whispered, "We called her Blue." "Why Blue?" "She had a blue ribbon and a necklace. She was nice." Rachel's heart sank. There hadn't been a Blue on the chalk list. That night, Rachel sat with the list again. Names that were never written down. Children who were never found. Storm lay beside her, resting his head on her foot like he always did when she sat too still for too long. The walls of the precinct's evidence room were covered with whiteboards, maps, old case files pinned like butterflies to cork. They had recovered 5 children, but they had uncovered something far more unsettling. A history the town had tried to forget. The press eventually moved on. The school district shut down Creek View Elementary for renovations, though Rachel knew they wouldn't reopen it. Not after this. Grady passed away in custody just 2 weeks later. Heart failure. No confession, no final words, just silence. But his death didn't bring closure. It brought more questions, because if he didn't add all those names to the list, who did? Months passed. The surviving children were placed with loving foster families. Rachel stayed in touch with each one. She made sure they were safe, that they were healing. Storm, now a local legend, was awarded a service medal at a county ceremony. He didn't care about the applause, but he never took his eyes off the mayor. Rachel noticed. It made her wonder. One afternoon, she returned to the attic of the old school alone. Just one last time, she walked quietly through the dust and memory and found something she hadn't seen before. Behind the insulation, tucked into the rafters, a wooden box. Inside were dozens of index cards, each with a name, each with a date, and written on the inside lid of the box in messy red marker. For the ones no one will miss. Rachel sat back on her heels, her breath caught. She wasn't just staring at evidence. She was staring at proof. Proof that Grady didn't act alone. Proof that someone else had kept the machine running. Quietly, efficiently, hidden in plain sight. That night, Rachel wrote a letter. To the State Bureau. To the FBI. She submitted everything. And attached a note. This is bigger than a janitor. The town of Creekview would never be the same. And maybe that was the point. Because sometimes justice isn't clean. Sometimes the truth doesn't come all at once. Sometimes it barks at a floorboard. And it takes a woman and her dog to listen. Thank you for following this story. Storm and Officer Rachel's journey reminds us of the power of paying attention. To instincts, to silence, and to what's buried beneath the surface. Now we'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if Storm hadn't stopped scratching at that floor? Or more haunting, what if he never barked at all?